So there I was, Commander Jake Morrison, standing in the gleaming corridors of the Galactic Military Academy on Station Nexus 7, wondering how exactly my career had taken this particular nosedive. One day I'm leading successful operations against pirate fleets. The next I'm being volunteered to teach a bunch of alien cadets what humans call basic combat fundamentals. The irony wasn't lost on me that the species who'd been calling us barely civilized primates for the past decade suddenly wanted to learn how we fight. Admiral Vorthak, a pompous four-armed Zentorian with more decorations than sense, had made it crystal clear this was a diplomatic gesture. The Galactic Council believes it would be educational for our students to observe primitive human tactics. He'd said, managing to make it sound like I was there to demonstrate how to make fire with sticks. My students were exactly what you'd expect from an elite academy. Princess Zara, a Valkyrian noble whose species had evolved past the need for actual physical conflict, spent most of her time adjusting her pristine uniform and looking like she'd never seen dirt before. Professor Beep, and yes, that was actually his name, represented the Zephyrian Collective, a race of hyper-analytical scholars who could calculate the trajectory of a falling leaf but couldn't throw a punch to save their lives. Then there was Grok, a massive grachnoid whose people were known throughout the galaxy as gentle giants, pacifists who'd rather hug their enemies than hurt them. The training facility itself was a monument to civilized warfare. Everything was white, sterile, and designed by committees who'd clearly never been shot at. The weapons were non-lethal, the obstacles were safety tested, and the whole place smelled like disinfectant and bureaucratic oversight. It was perfect for teaching the kind of polite, rule-following combat that got real soldiers killed. As I walked into that pristine classroom for the first time, watching my students sit at attention in their spotless uniforms, I couldn't help but grin. They had no idea what they were in for. Earth hadn't become a galactic power by following the rules or fighting fair. We'd clawed our way up from a backwater planet full of predators, and we'd learned that survival wasn't about honor or dignity. It was about winning. The first thing I did was start dismantling their fancy holographic combat simulator. You should have seen their faces. Princess Zara actually gasped, like I was desecrating a temple instead of unplugging an overpriced light show. "Commander Morrison," she said in that refined accent that screamed generations of inbreeding, "surely you're not suggesting we abandon proven tactical methodologies for whatever this is?" "This," I said, tossing a manual labeled Proper Military Decorum into the trash, "is called reality. And in reality, the enemy doesn't care about your methodology." Professor Beep raised one of his four hands, his insectoid features twitching with confusion. "But Commander, our combat algorithms have been refined over centuries of warfare. The statistical probability of success using standardized approaches is significantly higher than—" "Kid," I interrupted, "statistics are great right up until someone punches you in the face. Then it's all about who's still standing." Grok, bless his massive heart, was taking notes. The sight of a 7-foot-tall pacifist scribbling down observations about face punching was probably the highlight of my day. I walked over to their weapons rack, full of sleek, color-coded training tools that looked like they'd been designed by the same committee that approved their uniforms. "These are pretty," I said, picking up what they called a non-lethal combat simulator. "Very advanced, very civilized, completely useless." "But Commander," Zara protested, "those are state-of-the-art training implements designed to minimize injury while maximizing educational value." "Right, and when you're bleeding out in a ditch because your enemy didn't get the memo about minimizing injury, you'll die knowing you got the best education money could buy." I reached into my bag and pulled out a length of rope, a roll of duct tape, and a rubber duck. The silence in the room was deafening. "Earth's first rule of combat," I announced, watching their horrified faces, "is that anything can be a weapon if you're creative enough. Your enemy won't wait for you to find the right tool. They'll use whatever's handy, and if you're not ready for that, you're already dead." Professor Beep's mandibles clicked nervously. Surely you're not suggesting we abandon all protocols and— I'm suggesting, I said, starting to tie knots in the rope, that protocols are suggestions, not commandments. The moment you treat them like sacred law, you've lost the ability to adapt, and adaptation is what separates winners from casualties. Zara looked like she was about to faint. This is barbaric. No, I replied. This is effective. There's a difference, and you're about to learn it. By the third day, I had them crawling through mud. Real mud, not the sanitized training gel they were used to. Princess Zara's pristine uniform was now a shade of brown that would have made a sewage worker proud, and she was crying. Not from pain, mind you, but from the sheer indignity of being dirty. I don't understand the tactical value of this exercise, she sobbed, wiping mud from her aristocratic features. The tactical value, I explained, helping her out of the pit, is that your enemy won't care if you're comfortable. They won't wait for you to find a clean, well-lit area to fight in. Sometimes you'll be in the mud, sometimes in the dark, sometimes both. Getting used to discomfort now means staying alive later. Professor Beep was having his own crisis. I'd given him a simple task, disable a mock sentry using only household items. He'd spent an hour calculating angles and probability matrices before I finally showed him how a bar of soap in a sock makes an excellent improvised weapon. This violates 17 different protocols of civilized warfare, he protested, examining the soap sock with the kind of horror usually reserved for war crimes. Good, I said. Those protocols assume your enemy is civilized too. What happens when they're not? The look on his face suggested this possibility had never occurred to him. Grok, on the other hand, was thriving. The gentle giant had discovered a talent for creative problem-solving that frankly scared me a little. When I asked him to find a way past a locked door, he didn't pick the lock or find the key. He removed the hinges with a spoon. When I challenged him to immobilize a target without causing permanent damage, he invented a restraint system using shoelaces that would have impressed a Navy SEAL. Grok, I said, watching him demonstrate his latest creation, you realize your people are supposed to be pacifists, right? He nodded enthusiastically. Yes, Commander. We know hurt people. We just make them very, very stuck. I was starting to understand why the Grachnoids were so peaceful. They didn't need to fight. They could just rearrange you until fighting became impossible. The real breakthrough came when I introduced them to psychological warfare. Most species in the galaxy fought with honor, following established rules and traditions. Humans had learned that the best way to win a fight was to convince your enemy not to fight in the first place. Fear, I explained, is your most powerful weapon. Not the fear of death, that's too abstract. The fear of humiliation, of failure, of looking stupid in front of their peers. That's what breaks armies. Zara raised her hand tentatively. How does one weaponize embarrassment? And that's when I knew I had them. Week 2 was when things got interesting. I'd set up an obstacle course that looked like it had been designed by someone with serious psychological issues. Because it had been. Me. The course included crawling through actual sewage pipes, rappelling down surfaces covered in artificial blood, and navigating a maze filled with recordings of screaming. The other instructors had filed complaints. Admiral Vorthak had received angry calls from parents. I'd been threatened with court-martial twice. It was the best week of my career. This is inhumane, gasped Lieutenant Vex, a Krontharian instructor who'd been watching my students navigate the nightmare I'd created. You're traumatizing them. I'm preparing them, I replied, watching Zara emerge from the blood-covered tunnel with a look of grim determination that would have made her ancestors proud. Trauma is just another word for experience you survive. Princess Zara had undergone a remarkable transformation. The prissy noble who'd fainted at the sight of mud was now teaching the other students how to use their opponent's expectations against them. She'd figured out that looking helpless and innocent was the perfect setup for a devastating counterattack. The key, she explained to her classmates, is to let them underestimate you. Let them think you're weak, scared, incompetent. Then, when they're not paying attention, she demonstrated a move that would have left her opponent questioning every life choice that had led them to that moment. Professor Beep had stopped calculating probabilities and started thinking creatively. When faced with a hostage situation simulation, he didn't try to negotiate or find a tactical solution. He created a distraction so chaotic and confusing that the hostage-takers surrendered just to make it stop. I used their own communication frequencies against them, he explained excitedly. I broadcast 17 different contradictory orders simultaneously while playing their national anthem backwards. The cognitive dissonance was so overwhelming they became functionally paralyzed. But Grok was my masterpiece. The gentle giant had embraced what humans call aggressive pacifism. He'd figured out how to neutralize opponents without technically hurting them. His specialty was restraint technique so efficient and inescapable that enemies would beg to surrender, rather than endure the humiliation of being completely helpless while remaining unharmed. I not hurt anyone, he explained proudly, demonstrating a hold that left his practice partner completely immobilized but perfectly comfortable. I just make them take nap until they're ready to be reasonable. The breaking point came when Admiral Vorthak himself visited the training facility. He arrived expecting to find evidence of human barbarism that he could use to shut down the program. Instead, he found his students had built an improvised fortress out of training equipment and were conducting what they called advanced negotiations with a group of volunteer opponents. The negotiations involved Princess Zara convincing the enemy commander that his tactical plan was so brilliant it deserved to be shared with military historians, while Professor Beep created technical problems that made their equipment more hindrance than help. And Grok ensured that anyone who tried to leave the negotiation area found themselves gently but firmly returned to the discussion. This is not how civilized beings conduct warfare, Vorthak sputtered, watching his elite students systematically dismantle a simulated invasion force through methods that couldn't be found in any tactical manual. No, sir, I agreed. It's how effective beings conduct warfare. There's a difference. Graduation day arrived with all the pomp and circumstance you'd expect from a Galactic Military Academy. Representatives from dozens of species had come to observe the final examination, most of them expecting to witness the failure of human training methods. The test was simple. My students would face the Academy's elite Krontharian Guard unit in simulated combat. The Krontharians were the gold standard of galactic military excellence. They were disciplined, well-equipped, and had never lost a training exercise. They approached warfare like a chess game, with established moves, counter-moves, and strategies refined over centuries. They were everything my students were supposed to aspire to become. They never had a chance. The exercise began at dawn in a mock urban environment. The Krontharians deployed in textbook formation, established communication protocols, and began their systematic advance. They were beautiful to watch, like a military ballet performed by professionals who'd spent their entire lives perfecting their craft. My students were nowhere to be seen. The first sign of trouble came when the Krontharian commander received a formal surrender offer written in crayon and delivered by a small maintenance drone. The message read, "To the very impressive and surely unbeatable Krontharian forces, we, the humble students, recognize your obvious superiority and would like to discuss terms of surrender over refreshments. Please come to coordinates XYZ for negotiations. P.S. We brought snacks." The commander, being a reasonable sort, took half his force to the designated coordinates, expecting to accept a quick surrender and end the exercise early. He found Princess Zara waiting with an actual tea service and what appeared to be genuine respect for his tactical brilliance. "General," she said, somehow managing to bow while serving tea, "we've studied your approach and we're simply outclassed. Could you perhaps explain how you achieved such perfect unit coordination? We're eager to learn from masters of the craft." While Zara was inflating the commander's ego and getting him to reveal his entire tactical plan, Professor Beep was busy with the remaining Krontharian forces. He'd hacked their communication system, not to disable it, but to improve it. Every message was now being auto-corrected, translated through 17 different languages, and enhanced with helpful suggestions from the base's AI system. An order to advance became march forward with confidence while considering the philosophical implications of movement. A request for status updates turned into please compose a brief essay on your current emotional state and tactical preferences. Within an hour, the Krontharian forces were so busy trying to decode their own orders that they forgot they were supposed to be fighting. Meanwhile, Grok had been busy with what he called environmental optimization. He'd rearranged the mock urban environment in subtle ways. Doors that used to open in now opened out. Steps that used to go up now went down. Nothing was dangerous, nothing was damaged, but nothing worked quite the way it was supposed to. The Krontharian forces found themselves increasingly frustrated as their perfectly planned maneuvers were disrupted by architecture that didn't cooperate. Their tactical brilliance was useless when they couldn't predict which way a door would swing. The exercise ended when the Krontharian commander, still sipping tea and explaining his strategies to an attentive Princess Zara, suddenly realized that his forces had been systematically isolated, confused, and effectively neutralized without a single shot being fired. The silence from the observation deck was deafening. Admiral Vorthak stood at the observation window, his forearms hanging limp at his sides, watching the Krontharian forces extract themselves from Grok's architectural puzzle while trying to decode Professor Beep's enhanced communications. His expression suggested he was having the kind of existential crisis usually reserved for philosophers and tax auditors. "Commander Morrison," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of someone whose worldview had just been thoroughly demolished, "I believe I owe you an apology." "No, sir," I replied, trying not to grin too obviously. "You owe the galaxy a revelation." The other military observers were having their own quiet conversations, and I caught enough fragments to know that several species were already discussing requests for human military advisors. The Zephyrians wanted to know if we could teach creative tactical thinking to their analytical minds. The Velcarians were interested in what they delicately called unconventional warfare ethics. Even the Grachnoids had sent a representative to ask about advanced peaceful intervention techniques. Princess Zara had returned from her tea party with the Krontharian commander, looking insufferably pleased with herself. "Commander," she said, "I believe I understand now what you meant about adaptation. Rules are just starting points, aren't they?" "That's exactly right," I told her. "The moment you stop thinking and start just following procedures, you've lost the ability to respond to new situations. And warfare is nothing but new situations." Professor Beep was buzzing with excitement, his mandibles clicking rapidly. "The applications are endless. We could revolutionize diplomatic communications, trade negotiations, even academic debate. The principle of constructive chaos could transform how we approach problem-solving across the entire galactic community." Grok simply smiled his massive smile and handed me a small origami crane made from the wrapper of a combat ration. "Thank you, Commander, for teaching us that fighting is not about hurting. It's about helping enemy understand they would rather not fight." That night, as I packed my gear for the next assignment, I found a message waiting for me. Admiral Vorthak had submitted a formal request to Earth Command for the establishment of a new course, Advanced Human Tactical Theory. The course description made me laugh out loud. It read, "An intensive study of unconventional problem-solving methods, creative adaptation techniques, and the practical application of organized chaos to complex strategic challenges." In other words, they wanted me to teach more aliens how to think like humans. The galaxy was about to become a much more interesting place. As I sealed the last of my equipment cases, I reflected on what we'd really accomplished here. It wasn't just about teaching combat techniques or tactical innovation. We'd shown the galaxy that sometimes the best way to solve a problem is to change the rules of the problem itself. Humans hadn't become a galactic power by being the strongest or the smartest or the most advanced. We'd gotten there by being the most adaptable, the most creative, and the most willing to try something nobody had ever thought of before. And now we were sharing that gift with the rest of the galaxy. God help us all. The universe had just gotten a lot more interesting, and something told me that was exactly what it needed. After all, the galaxy was a big place full of unexpected challenges. It was going to need all the creative problem solvers it could get. Even if those problem solvers happened to be a bunch of formerly civilized aliens who'd learned that sometimes the best solution is the one nobody sees coming. Welcome to the human way of doing things, Galaxy. Try to keep up.